Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. Tiz, hello. How are you?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
You've had not a stressful morning at all. Totally fine. Didn't have
Nope,
to bike to work real
we're all
quick.
good.
Nothing.
Nope.
For those
Didn't
listening,
happen. Pretend
the
that didn't
podcast
happen.
is never as smooth as you think, and so these things happen. But we're here now, and you have a better
Yep.
backdrop. That's what we said. Perfectly setting the tone.
Yeah. It fits now, Yeah.
It's more on brand with what you stand for.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's okay. So we'll start over and we'll kind of go from here, which is when we were chatting before, it was that,
Yep.
a lot of people, I think, see your very helpful and popular Instagram and the exercises. And I obviously share a lot of those things that I believe in are great. But people might not be super familiar with who you are and how you are kind of in this position of gymnastics coach / strength coach / this. So can you maybe just quickly share the background that got you to where you are now?
Sure. Okay, so I was a gymnast myself, and like many people, ex-gymnast turned coach about 15 years ago. And then coached for a few years and then went to school in the UK for sports therapy, which is like athletic therapy over here. But because of insurance, I can't practice as that. So I, finished school in the UK, applied for a job in Canada, having never been here. But 4 years
Classic.
later, here I am, still
Classic.
here. Exactly. Staying, love it. It's great. Anyway, was coaching full time. That's what the job was, and missed the body stuff from athletic therapy, and found NSCA, and did CSCS, so strength and conditioning. And just kind of meshed the two together. And
Super
I
interesting.
now have a coaching position that allows me to do both, which is like the dream. So
Yeah, that's amazing. And
yeah.
I didn't ask this before, but so when you kind of came up in the traditional coaching realms, I'm guessing that weights were
Yep.
not a thing and lifting was not a thing. And was there like something that changed your mind, or was there something that made you like, wait a minute, I think this could be beneficial for gymnasts?
Yeah. Well, I myself had spondy when I was a gymnast,
Mm,
and then I had surgery when I was 16. So I
mm,
think my experience in gymnastics kind of has molded the way I am today.
got it.
Just because, I don't think anyone should have to go through that, obviously.
Yeah.
So then, having kind of putting that knowledge into play to help the kids is, a big thing.
Yeah. And for those who aren't familiar,
And
a spondy is a stress fracture in the back, right? So that was a serious
mhm,
injury.
yeah. It wasn't nice and it wasn't fun, but
Yeah.
it happened and here we are. So
Yeah.
it's making the best out of it now, right?
Right.
But just I guess through school and through learning the strength and conditioning modules, just kind of realizing that hey, this stuff is useful.
Mm.
And then I followed you forever, so
Oh,
kind
thanks.
of seeing you're welcome, seeing the stuff that you were putting out and thinking, hey, this stuff can happen, right?
Yeah.
But then just finding the right environment for it to happen in is
Sure. Yeah. That's super important. We'll come back to that. And yeah, I think now
uh-huh.
being on the other side of, maybe 5, 10 years of slowly learning more myself, I think there's a universal kind of like undertone in gymnastics, but especially with coaches, which is like, we feel as though maybe we've been trying to do what has been recommended, which is only body weight and maybe just doing the traditional gymnastic stuff and handstands and ropes, which all have their value. But I feel like a lot of us still get to the same endpoint, which is like, well, this is kind of not optimal. It's not really getting me all the way there. Kids are still really injured and kids are still struggling with not seeing great power progress, flexibility stuff, still struggling. So I feel like a lot of coaches are maybe a little bit frustrated, and kind of where you and I both came from, which is like, okay, I've been doing the traditional stuff for like 10 years and I feel as though maybe I'm still not seeing the progress I'd like, which I think is where the conversation comes in, which is like curiosity about what else is available. And you see every other sport is doing some sort of lifting in an off season combined with their sport. And you're like, cool, well, maybe there is value here for gymnasts. So that was my journey to it. Did you have something similar or no?
Yeah, for sure. And I think I myself, as like an adult at school, I started lifting. So
Right.
then being like, hey, like as a gymnast, being, you know, mobile, and I'm good at these movements, so like why can't gymnasts themselves, as still practicing gymnasts, you know, be good at these movements? And yeah, just like the movement patterns can reflect, right? Like they mirror each other from what the kids need. And I think, like, especially an event like vault, you know, progress is so slow, and almost power is vault, right? So I don't know. Yeah, that's a big
Yeah,
thing too,
sprinting
right?
fast is helpful for vault, right?
Exactly. Yeah. You can keep doing the same not so good vault over and over again, and until you get better at being powerful, how do you get better at vault, you know? So,
and that's always my kind of like, I guess I try to maybe like simplify for people, which is like power, which is very much a huge part of gymnastics, is very much an equation of like force, and we know velocity, right? Or time. And so just being like, okay, well, like, how do you produce more force? Like, what does the research say on more force? It's like, well, yeah, body weight stuff helps, technique helps, but resistance training is like the gold standard for getting faster and producing more force. So it's like, there probably is some benefit here, you know?
Yeah. And I think I also came to the realization with like body weight stuff that, you know, you have to just keep doing more reps because it's the same weight the whole time, right? And you reach that threshold of that, you know, muscular endurance or whatever, and then after that point, you know, what's the point? You can manipulate things easier if you add weight, right? Like,
right.
yeah.
And to that too as well, which is like, that's the performance side, which is like, you know, lifting a little bit helps you to get the type of motor units that are very important for power, but also like, what do you think injuries are? Injuries are just an equation that the force is higher than your body's capacity to tolerate it, whether it's in one instance where you get an ACL tear, unfortunately, or whether it's repetitively over time, whereas all those small like overload landings equal a stress fracture or Sever's disease or some sort of muscular irritation or a spondy fracture, right? Like that is very much a capacity workload issue. And I feel like lifting is the best way to try to fill in more capacity when maybe someone's growing or someone's not able to tolerate a lot of reps, you know?
And yeah, like you said, like the forces on landings, right? Like how do you prepare the body to tolerate that force on a double front or on the floor or something, double back, you know? Like how do you get to that point where the body's like, okay, I can do it without blowing an Achilles, or, you know, like
Totally.
yeah.
And I think going back to when you first started is obviously you probably went through quite a transition, which is like, okay, I think this is valuable. I'm going to learn it. So taking your CSCS, which is great. What was the initial like stepping into, were you at this gym where you introduced it? Was there pushback? Were like parents and gymnasts worried about it? Like, or was it like smooth sailing?
I was at another gym, and yeah, it didn't happen. So now I'm where I am. And luckily for me, like COVID worked in my favor because before COVID, I was here. I started here a few months before COVID, and I was just in a rec program, just coaching. And I had done a mobility, flexibility like seminar for a old coworker from my last place at his new place of work. And one of the WAG coaches here had seen me post it on Instagram. And she was like, whoa, this person knows stuff and she's within our gym. Like, why is she not in the WAG program? Anyway, COVID happened, and I was asked to program conditioning during COVID for them. And then, yeah, it just went from there. But I'm super lucky. Like, there's 3 of our WAG coaches all work out themselves. Like,
that's amazing.
2 were very involved in CrossFit, and then another just works out. So like everybody gets it. So there was from that standpoint, from coworker standpoint, there was no pushback. Like I was given full trust right away, which was amazing. Yeah. And then I think because we're all on the same page, there's been no parent pushback, which is also a big thing. I think we're lucky here as well. The parents have full trust in us, and because we're all like a united front, nobody is like dissing it. It makes it very easy for us.
Yeah. That's super helpful, right? Having a culture of communication and everyone kind of is on board, and you guys are clearly role modeling that you work out and you're healthy yourself. So that reflects on the parents, and the kids are interested in that. Like, that's very, very important to get things off the ground.
Yeah, and it's never been a problem, and now the kids themselves love lifting.
Yeah.
Like, but we also, the culture and the communication, like we give them the option. So it's like, how's
Mm,
your body today? Are you too sore from deadlifts yesterday? Like, you can say you're too sore. We don't care. You can choose whether to condition or not.
sure.
And 9 times out of 10, they'll condition, and
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm a
It's like,
massive fan of that approach, which is like
mhm,
conditioning is all everything's voluntary. It's always
yep,
optional. It's a voluntary
yep,
activity, but also like, choices have consequences. And if you want to continue to do the conditioning, we never barter with conditioning, or
mm-mm,
positive or negative. So, I mean, obviously
no,
there's times when kids are younger, it's more of like you're herding cats and you're trying to get them to do what you want. But as kids get older,
yeah,
like they know that if they put in the work and they do it, like they'll reach their goals. If they don't put
mhm,
in the work and they
mhm,
don't, then they're going to be upset down the road. So like it's maturity there,
exactly.
.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I think we're going into our like third cycle or like year of lifting.
Mhm.
And the whole way through, we've had, or at least the past 2 years, as I've got better at it too, we've had programs in binders. And recently, for some reason, they've been looking back at like their old numbers, and they themselves can see the numbers and the progress
Mm, right.
in their strength, right? And like we've got kids that their training has gone down, so they're conditioning less, but they're coming in a day extra just to condition because they
Sure.
themselves feel different.
Sure.
This is teenagers, so they're more aware and they get it.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's very good and they love it. So
Yeah, and that's awesome, and
yeah.
having obviously a background in both is I think sometimes people are nervous that if they do start to lift or they start to do more, they're gonna miss out on the traditional gymnastic stuff. So what is maybe the balance between, lifting and traditional gymnastic stuff in your gym? Does it change by
Mhm.
season or is it kind of like throughout the year?
Hmm. Yeah, so we have like periodization, like the cycle. So we kind of finish the season in June-ish.
Mhm.
So then we'll just do some light stuff for a couple of weeks, and then it kind of works that we have 2 weeks off at the end of June, beginning of July. So that's like extra time for them just to recover.
Yep.
And then we come back in and we start it kind of light, just, general stuff, hypertrophy.
Mhm.
And we'll do that for the first kind of 6, 8 weeks of summer just to get them
Mhm.
back in it. And then this year we've had two different strength cycles. So we did 6 week, I think, like August, September ish.
Mhm.
And then we're just finishing up a second one now. We had a week in the middle where we just had a little like deload,
Mhm.
just to recover a little. And then the end of this week, Sunday, we're starting power. So we got a 6 week power cycle that will take us to Christmas time ish.
Nice.
Because our season is a bit later than your guys, like
Sure.
over there, down there.
Yep.
Like we have a competition at the beginning of December, but it's like the first one of the season, so it's
Got it.
no, nothing big. It is
Yep.
trials to a competition, which kind of sucks.
Yep.
But it is what it is. And then after that, we'll do some kind of like circuit, just building a base ready for routines.
Sure.
Um, and then in season, I've made like mobility sheets, we call them. So we have got like different body parts.
Yep.
So it's like shoulder, thoracic, and then there's two giant sets within it. Like the first giant set is a rolling, stretch, and a strength, and then
Yep.
there's like a second giant set with three similar things. So yeah, we got four different sheets, different body parts. Some are gymnastics, like handstand,
Yep.
splits,
Yep.
modeling off your stuff, for the handstand and the splits, and that kind of mobility circuit. Um, and that's if they choose not to condition on a day because they're too sore, that's what they'll do.
Got
Just
it.
kind of like a bit of recovery mobility. Um, so yeah, for the 4 months that they're in season, we
Mhm.
generally just do that to keep their bodies happy because
Sure.
obviously they're getting enough load in routines and gymnastic stuff, so we
Yeah.
don't want to overload them.
Yeah,
So yeah.
that makes a ton of sense, and I think I would be remiss to kinda keep maybe adding, going sub-levels here. So within your maybe off-season, preseason, how many days per week is that? Are you lifting?
Um, it depends on the kid's schedule.
Sure.
So within all levels, mm, I guess optionals mostly. We have kids that train 3 to 5 days.
Yep.
So the ones that train 3 generally condition 2, and the ones that train 5 generally condition 3 or 4, depending on the days they train.
Okay.
Because
Are those all
I
lifting, or is it like split between gymnastics and lifting?
in the off season it's lifting,
Yep.
but then as we go like the power, and there's one day where it's not,
Okay.
just to let them recuperate a little.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then on,
But it's
is there some extra event stuff like in a warm up or on events, or is it pretty much all into that like 30 to 45-minute session?
um yeah, maybe like a little on bars, but other than that, like, and warm up, I guess, yeah.
Yep.
Other than that, we lift.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Great.
yeah,
I love it. I'm here for it.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, we've got kids that do well, so it's not
Yeah.
like the results don't show, although that's not what we're about at all.
Sure.
We're just about kids being kids, right, and being happy
Yep.
and healthy. But yeah, I don't know. It works for us, and I don't know whether this year we had lots of people winning vault, and I don't know whether it's just that's because it is or because we lift. Like it's
Sure.
so hard to tell.
Yeah, well, I think it's good to hear for people, which is they're worried that if they kind of dive in the deep end and try to do lifting and do this stuff, but they're like, I don't know if this is going to go well, and so they're a little nervous
Mhm.
to commit that much to lifting, especially in an off season when you want to work skills and you have other stuff you want to do. So hopefully throughout the podcast, people have heard many instances where you can add lifting and it's very, very beneficial long term. You just
Mhm.
have to be willing to work with someone either who knows what they're doing or learn it more yourself, or be willing to change just a little bit of like maybe some of your ideas. So yeah, I think it's
Yep.
very helpful for people to hear that you guys are doing well.
Yeah, and yeah, injury wise too. I mean, again, I don't know if it's just the culture as a whole, us at the lifting, but we don't really, since we've been doing it, injuries have been to a minimum. So
Yeah, it's
touch wood.
probably all of it, right? It's the culture, it's
Yeah,
the communication,
exactly.
it's the lifting, it's probably technique and understanding. It's
Yeah.
it's being able to back off or push when you feel as though you need to. It's proper planning and preparation. Like it's all those things. It really is.
Yeah. But
And then
it's
kind of
working.
within that,
So.
yeah, within that too, which is like, okay, so now a coach is probably like, all right, this sounds legit. And like, I can understand maybe trying this next year is looking down the barrel of like, I want to do a 30 to 45-minute lifting program or find someone who can help me is like, that's probably really intimidating for someone to even know where to
Mhm,
start. So
mhm.
let's maybe just go with a basic introduction of like, what does a typical lifting session look like maybe in the off season or preseason for you guys?
So if we're talking like the optional kids, the ones that have
Yep.
their own stuff,
Yep.
we again, it depends if it's hypertrophy or strength, because obviously strength you've got more sets, so you're probably gonna do less things.
Yep.
So like say we're just starting, we're just in a hypertrophy. I'll do like a warm up of 5 things that are just like an unweighted version of what they're gonna do in their workout, just to get their body and their mind into it.
Mhm.
Um, and then I'll do like a main lift, so a compound, a deadlift, a goblet squat, probably for hypertrophy, not back squat, a hip thrust, a rear foot elevated split squat. Like they're the 4 go-tos that we'd start with.
Yep.
And then I'm going to superset that with something. It's usually a core something,
Mhm.
just to get the most bang for our buck.
Yep.
And it also helps equipment wise if we superset, because then we can just
Sure.
pair up. And then the second thing within that workout would be some kind of upper body thing. So, either vertical, horizontal pressing or a pulling. And all of that stuff, other than pull ups, we do single arm just to, keep everything balanced.
Yeah.
And again, I will pair that up with something. Sometimes it's like a hip accessory. So some kind of like glute thing just to,
Mhm.
keep that area happy. And then we have a third set of usually 3 that are just purely accessories.
Yep.
So it depends what we've done in the upper body, but it would be like if we've done a pushing, we'll do some kind of pulling accessory. So like a plank band row, or
Yep.
and then vice versa. Like we do like a lot of dumbbell windmills or half Turkish get ups,
Mhm.
and then some kind of like dumbbell core, so like a suitcase carry or a farmer's carry.
Sure.
and we'll do like a bit of calf in there too. So some kind of like single leg calf raise, or, just to keep everything happy.
Sure. Yeah, and
Um,
that makes a lot of sense for sure. And I think so maybe where are like some of the more gymnastic specific stuff getting added in, like maybe like dish or art shaping or handstand work or like active flexibility? Is
mhm,
that on events? Is that
mhm.
somewhere else you guys add that? Because I feel like that's probably going to be in there somewhere.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That would, yeah, be more on events,
Got it.
or on the days where we do sheets.
Yep.
So some, depending on the season, I would, yeah, like competition season, one of the days that we do sheets, it will be like a more gymnastic sheet. So
Mhm.
we'll do like the split circuit or the handstand circuit. We do a lot of the handstand stuff in warm up sometimes. Like, I don't know, 2 out of the 5 days we'll do a handstand board. So
Yep.
it's just like a variation of the sheet where I'll add in different things, just for, yeah, that handstand, the lat mobility and stuff like that.
Sure. Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's very helpful to kind of hear it all broken down that way. And I guess the last lowest all the way down there is like, what are you said you're trying to go more for like strength or hypertrophy? Is that 3 sets of 10? Is that 4 sets of 5? Like, what's the thought process behind
Mhm.
sets and reps and all that kind of stuff?
Yep, yep. So in that part of the season where we're at the beginning, I'll start them with like 3 sets of 12. So the weight is lighter, so they can just, get into it. And then the way I program is like I'll do 3 sets of 12, and then the next week will be 3 sets of 10, and then maybe I'll change it to 4 sets of 10 the next
Mhm.
week. So there's always some kind of overload,
Yep.
and then we'll go down to like the eights, and yeah. But the kids kind of know that as the reps drop, they should be increasing the weight. So the older kids are very independent and like proficient in kind of knowing that. So like in our strength cycle now, for example, we're down to like 5 sets of 3.
Mm.
So the weight is high, and yeah, they know that it's, increased in that way.
Yeah.
And with the compound lifts, we try to make it easy in that, like, I'll start them at a weight that I think is, easy for the 12 reps, and then every week they'll just add 10 pounds,
Yep.
and then just so whether it's, taxing them or not, just so there's some kind of overload.
Yep.
And then with the older kids in the strength cycle, for sure, like the last set, I'll make it a plus.
Mhm.
So they're not going to like fatigue. They're not crushing it, but they will do as many as they can safely do, just
Sure.
so both them and I are aware of how much more they could add.
Yep.
Um, so like, I don't know, last week we had a kid she was squatting 105 and she did 10 reps on the last set. So it's like, okay, this week we're
Yeah.
only doing 3, so this week
Yeah.
we can go straight to 125. Like,
Sure.
it's just like a nice gauge for them to see and for me to see.
Yeah, that sounds very, very, not easy to implement, but it sounds like pretty basic, which is great for people to hear. It's not this
Mhm,
very overwhelming, super stressful, very complex, approach to it. But and then I think the other thing that sometimes people get intimidated by is like logistically, which is like you have 15 to 20 athletes in front of you. They have different strengths, weaknesses, ages, whatever. And it sounds like you guys use binders, which I'm a massive fan of doing as well. But also, is
mhm,
this something that everyone does together? Are they rotating through like that conditioning station at different times? Like if you were to have them all together, how do you try to
mhm.
make sure it's not like a logistical nightmare?
Yeah. Again, I think because we're super lucky and our culture is so good and it's so accepted, we have conditioning as an event.
Sure.
So I mostly only have max 8 athletes at a time.
Yep.
So that makes life easier. We're also pretty well equipped, which also makes it easier. That's been a work in progress though. Like when I first started doing it, we had 2 barbells in a storage cupboard, a few
Mhm.
plates, and some
Yeah.
dumbbells on the floor. Like,
Sure.
so it's been a slow progress to get to that point. But now we have like four of every dumbbell up to like 20, and then we go to 40, and we got 3 barbells and a bunch of plates. So
Nice.
um, we're, yeah, that kind of being overwhelmed. I mean, sometimes it happens, because the way I program their conditioning is they'll get like, so they all get the same program, depending on the days they train and how much they condition. But they'll work through the days as they train. So they'll work through it at a different pace, basically. But some days I'll end up with like 6 of the 8 of them hip thrusting. And it's like, okay. And they're all hip thrusting different weights. So we have to like figure out a way to make that. And it's a lot of barbell math. So that's always fun. But yeah, I think being prepared is also a big thing. Like before they'll come to me on conditioning, sometimes I'll get their sheets out and be like, okay, this kid's squatting, this kid's, so then I can kind of get ready for it. But like I said, it's been a work in progress, but we're now at the stage where they come, they get their sheet out, they look what they need to do, and they go. Like I don't need to say anything. We're now slowly getting to the point where they're loading their own barbells, which is amazing. But that's been a work. Like loading the barbell and putting the plates away, that's been
in the butt.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's 2 maybe lessons here. One is that you have to have a lot of time on the front end to plan things and research what exercises, how do I coach these exercises up? What is a squat supposed to look like versus when it doesn't look great? What can I do to help out? Like that is the grunt work of learning to become a good strength coach, which is like, okay, what exercises, how do I coach them? How do I cue them? How do I change them for different athletes? But also like for binders, right? Which is like, you have to make a program in advance. And the second piece of this, which is you shouldn't just try to like throw this at the athletes. Like if you want to do this, and the episode's coming out in the fall here, right? If you want to do this, the time to do it is probably next spring, right? Or next post meet season. So you should be thinking about like, okay, what do we want to do next year? What can I do to read or learn, or what courses or what books can I do, so that you can build this program well in advance. And then when you get done with season, you have your break, you can spend a week or 2 kind of like fumbling your way uphill so that you know what it feels like and they know what it feels like. I think that's probably the most important lesson here, is because it's easy to hear the podcast and like, oh, this is so cool, I'm going to try it. But like, it's probably not the best approach, because it makes you so stressed out to try to throw it all in at once,
Yeah, for sure. And I think it would, like, it's beneficial at this point. You could almost start working those movement patterns,
Right.
If you've got a whiteboard, you don't need weights to learn how to squat, or, learn how to deadlift with a dowel. Or my favorite one at the moment for deadlift is, have you seen the one with like the foam roller, and you get it at the hips, and then like we're getting all the little kids to do that just for, just to learn the movement pattern. And as long as the coach understands what it looks like, which for the main lifts doesn't take too much, the kids can include that within their conditioning now, right?
Right.
Yeah,
as a good warm-up, right, or that movement.
Yeah, exactly. Just to learn that base. And that's how we kind of introduce it with like our level 2s, right? So 6-7-year-olds, that their conditioning for this whole year is just learning the movement patterns. Just so that then once they train 2.5 hours, but once they go with the kids that train 3.5 hours, they're going to have 30 minutes of conditioning. So to get them to that point where they're ready to know what something on the whiteboard means and use a weight with it, we take that year to kind of prepare them to get there.
Yeah, I'm super happy you said that. And that was my next question, which is I think a lot of times the conversation of, weights and age and when to start and all that kind of stuff is starting to get a little bit, on the radar. And so I think obviously when they're very young, it's the place to just teach them the movement patterns, as you say, and maybe obviously there's a lot of gymnastic stuff they have to focus on to develop skills. But what does it look like around obviously estimates of ages of like, okay, we start to introduce the basics here, we start to actually load them a little bit here, and then this is the age where we're like gas pedal, we're going to really like get after this pretty hard.
Yeah. For us, it kind of looks like, the level 2, so 6-7, they all do everything without weights for a year, just to, dial in the movement patterns so they become comfortable with them. And then we've got some like 8-year-old level 3s. They're using 5 8-pounders, nothing crazy. Just again, getting that movement pattern ready and dialed in and safe. And then from that point, 9, 10, that's when we'll start loading them up again, as long as technique stays okay. Like as soon as things start looking wobbly or not correct, they drop down.
Yeah. And I think it's good to mention too that like people are concerned about growth plates, but there's actually no research that's contraindicated for that kind of stuff. So like if you're doing it with
Mhm.
proper technique, proper programming, you've had 2 years to learn movement patterns and you're building it correctly, it's actually one of the best things that young kids can do, pending that it's done properly, right?
Yeah, yeah, and especially when it's in a sport like gymnastics, like you can't say that lifting weights is going to affect growth plates when the forces just in gymnastics itself, you know. Okay, let's not do
Astronomical.
gymnastics when
Yeah.
we're 8, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then to
So,
that, I think that makes a lot of sense for like the background, right? Which is like, okay, plan these things out, get a good strength cycle in early,
mhm.
get them strong. I'm curious about what changes when you move into like the preseason and like the more power aspect, because we're trying to transfer these strength gains to actual power and output. So is it an exercise change? Is it a set and rep change? Like what are you doing differently in preseason to try to make sure that power is really the main focus?
So instead of, so on Sunday we're starting our power, and we'll still do those compound lifts, but instead of pairing them with like a core or something, I'm going for power. So we're gonna like try the contrast power.
Yep.
So like for example with our deadlift, it's still only going to be 3 sets of 3, but we're pairing it with 3 sets of 6 continuous long jumps, right?
Yep.
So it's just trying to get that fast twitch going. Same with a squat, still going to be the same reps, just 3 sets paired with a seated box jump. So
Mhm.
going from sitting on a low box to jumping up to a high box. And same rear foot elevated split squats. We're going to do it goblet like we do normally, but then we're going to dump the dumbbell and go for the jumps. And last, hip thrusts. So we're going to do hip thrust, and we're pairing it with like a med ball overhead toss, just to get
Nice.
that kind of like hip extension with the shoulder. You know, that I love that for gymnastics because it's
Yeah.
so, you know, it's so transferable that it's a good. Yeah.
Yeah, and with the thought process there being, which I think is a value add, right? Which is like you can see or reverse med ball throw kind of looks like a, takeoff off floor, or, squatting looks like landing. But also too is that there's a huge value in
Mhm.
trying to allow someone to express their power in a very, very safe way, which is like throw this ball as hard as you
Yep.
can or jump as high as you can. It's very different than being like tumble as hard as you can, right? Like that's very
Yeah.
stressful sometimes to have someone to do. So this is
Mhm.
an opportunity to really tap into like the just do it really hard. You're going to be safe. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It doesn't take any real mental ability, you know, like tumbling,
Mhm.
they have to stay fresh and mentally capable, right? So it's not as safe in that way.
Yep.
But also in that note, we did do like a Olympic lifting seminar in the summer
Yep.
with a coworker.
Yep.
He's an Olympic lifting coach. But we haven't included that because I think again it's to get the power gain, it's so mental, right? Like they have to
Yeah.
get everything right. And even for me, that's like overwhelming, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and I just think there's other ways we can gain power without it being so technical.
Yeah, we were talking about this at Champion 2 as well, which is unfortunately when you have so much stuff you have to do in a day and you're trying to get a training effect, like teaching a young gymnast to hang clean is there's a lot of
Mhm.
things to get right before they
Exactly.
actually are going to jump hard. So like there might be a trade-off there of just doing a seated dumbbell jump or some sort of a push press or some sort of broad jump, right? And getting very similar
Mhm.
types of power output, but maybe not at the constraint of having to go through the technical aspects. And then of course, front racks are mobility wise very demanding on someone to do well with
Mhm.
your wrists and your
Mhm.
shoulders. So like it's tough. I have a lot of friends that are hardcore Olympic lifters. And yes, I see
Yep.
the value, but at the same time, like only so many hours in the day to train one technique.
Exactly. And I don't know, part of me feels like we should treat it like I do with the younger level twos in that they're learning
Mm,
movement patterns. So maybe we include it as part of, the accessories. And we do
yeah,
spend a few minutes every week just going through the technique so that one day they can do it, you know?
sure.
That's part of my thinking right now.
And it
But
is something too long term that if you have someone like an older athlete who's committed to multiple years, maybe they're going to be involved. Maybe like getting that involved so that maybe like their second or third or fourth year, they can do it. Like I think about it the same way with like advanced training methods, like using chains on a trap bar deadlift, right? Or doing some
mhm,
sort of like
mhm,
very advanced variation with like contrast, for example, or bands. Like when
mhm,
an athlete is mature enough and they have a training age where they understand how to create tension, how to protect themselves, how to be safe, maybe that's where it comes in. So we have had some people who we teach like hang cleans or things like that after a while. And but yeah, I think generally speaking, where gymnastics is culturally and in terms of like knowledge adaptation, it's like a little bit farther down the pike, than I think we're dealing with now.
Yeah.
Just doing anything
Yeah.
with weight is probably our first starting point.
Exactly. And that's me saying that, and technically I'm qualified to do it, right? So
Sure.
gymnastics coaches that aren't qualified trying to think that can happen, I think is, a bit too far. But
Yeah, I'd like to transition to maybe chop through some of the myths that I think people do have still in the culture, and maybe just hear your experiences with it, which is injuries. I think we covered, right? Which is like, it's a little hypocritical to say one is dangerous, but gymnastics is fine. But the other big one I think I want to have your perspective on is like that. The fear is that as soon as I lift weights, I will gain inordinate amounts of mass and I will lose all my gymnastic skills and I won't be as finessey with my, bar releases and stuff like that. Is that like, what's your experience with all that kind of stuff? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No. I think, yeah, as I said, we're going into our third year, and as you can tell from me talking, like we've done a lot of lifting, and we do a lot of lifting, and
Mm,
I don't think any of the kids have grown in size more than they would have if they'd just been doing gymnastics. I
sure.
think gymnastics in itself, and especially gymnastics style conditioning, like old school, is hypertrophy, right? Like the amount of reps they do with their body weight, that's hypertrophy. So the amount of that we do in lifting is 8 weeks,
Right.
um, compared to the whole year of gymnastics, right? And I think as well, like muscles have to grow a little to get stronger, to get powerful,
Sure.
right? So that's inevitable. And like the perfect storm of them getting bigger and getting enough sleep and eating the correct thing, it's just, is that really going to happen to a
Yeah.
13-year-old girl? I don't know.
Yeah.
And
There's
just
two parts to it.
hormones and
One
all
is,
that, like.
yeah, there's two aspects to it. One is that when you actually work with athletes who are intentionally trying to gain mass, so like Olympic lifters, power lifters, like we have friends of ours that are literally like, I need to put 10 pounds on to move this kilo faster or more aggressively. And you actually look at their training schedule, it's like, good God, like you're squatting 4 days
Hmm.
per week, you're eating a ridiculous amount of calorie surplus, you're training close to failure with just insane weights. Like, obviously, you
Hmm.
could go to failure in a different way, but I feel like what you actually have to do to get that much of excessive mass fast is unbelievably challenging. So there's one aspect to it, and the second piece of it too is that when you, like you noted too, is when you look at the research on what truly causes hypertrophy, it's often very like lower rep with extremely high repetitions, close to failure. And a lot of traditional gymnastic strength training is that. Like, think about how many
Hmm.
squat jumps that some kids do, right? Squats and squat jumps and resi jumps and block jumps, like leg lifts, 500 leg lifts, rope climbs, like pull-ups, like a lot of what you fear as a
Yep.
traditional method is actually probably creating that hypertrophy. And it's like,
Hmm.
oh, it's like I had to shoot myself in the foot a little bit when I learned that. I was like, oh my God, the programs that I am doing, I'm avoiding weights because I'm worried it's going to make these athletes get excessively bulky. But then when I look at my 4 sets of 25 squat jumps and my 4 sets of 40 calf raises and my 4 sets of 25 leg lifts, this is training close to failure and is hypertrophy. Like, I'm actually
Hmm.
creating that.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think that's just knowledge too, right? Like
Right.
people don't know that. So why would they think any different? Like
Sure.
everybody, not everybody, but many people think lifting weights, you're just a bodybuilder, or, like there's that kind of narrow mindset, not the other benefits that it can allow for, especially in gymnastics. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
And also too on that wavelength, which is again what TikTok influencers and magazines show you versus what sports performance is. And we're constantly having this educational conversation with the gymnasts that come to our facility, which is like, okay, well, sports performance is completely different than bodybuilding or CrossFit or powerlifting, which is fine in their own right. But then even
Hmm.
within that subset, like what a baseball player does or a lacrosse player does is completely different than what we ask our gymnasts to do. And then within
Yeah.
that, like there's a gymnast program is highly individualized based on their injuries, based on their goals, based on their level. So like if you can find great sports performance strength coaches who understand this, like what actually shows up on paper and in a lift is completely different than what I think a lot of people's misunderstanding of that is. You know what I mean? Split squats and step
Hmm.
ups and that kind of stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think as well, kind of related to this, like a lot of the programming I'll do with lifting is to try and counteract the overused muscles in gymnastics, right? So
Sure.
it's like, the compound lifts that we'll include for the legs are hopefully more posterior chain than
Right.
quad. So,
Right.
you're trying to balance out the gymnastics overuse of those muscles by loading others a little, right? Like, so
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully
And
it's kind of counteracting.
sure. And on that note, I think you kind of, when you were going through programming, 'cause I mean, obviously it's very natural to do. So you kind of rip through a bunch of exercises that are beneficial. But I'd love to maybe transition to give people some tangible things to think about, which is like maybe 3 lower body exercises, 3 core, 3 upper body, 3 accessory. And then we can either
Mhm.
include show notes or YouTube links or put the videos up so that people can maybe see what it looks like and then understand maybe
Mhm.
why it translates to gymnastics. So I mean, let's go lower body first, which is like, let's just go with like 3
Okay.
very beneficial leg exercises for gymnasts to lift.
Yep, yep, yep. Weighted or unweighted?
Yeah, weighted. So we'll talk about like, I
Weighted.
think unweighted, they probably got a lot in their bag to choose
Yeah,
from,
yeah,
but
yeah, for sure.
probably
Yeah. I think number one for me, just because it's single leg and yeah, it's great. Rear foot elevated split squat.
yep.
Um, it's the one that the kids actually don't like, but I think that's because it's difficult and they feel it. So yeah, that's number one. Deadlift, just because it's compound everywhere, whole posterior chain.
Yep.
Um, and it's interesting actually, deadlift wise, the kids always have like sore back muscles, like erector spinae, just because they're not used to holding that flat position, right?
Mm.
Um, so just kind of, yeah, back strength, I think, in that kind of flat position is
Mhm.
great for it.
Mhm.
And then hip thrust, just because science and glute strength and like
The best quote ever come out of the podcast.
yeah. Just because
Science.
science. Yeah, yeah. So yeah. And single leg hip thrust too, but it's harder to load as much, right? Like,
Sure. Yeah, and by
yeah.
science, what we're joking at is that, there's very good evidence on what exercises work certain muscles, right? And I think notoriously underloaded in gymnastics is direct glute training, which is why a hip thrust is so good because you look at the research from like Brett Contreras and many others are saying like, all right, the
Mhm.
glute max is super important for jumping and sprinting, which is exactly what gymnastics needs as well as landing forces. What exercises are out there to work on this? The single leg hip
Yeah.
thrust, the deadlift, and like then you look in like a lot of programs and like nowhere to be found. And if they are doing some sort of a hinge, it's like a single leg offset, like balance based RDL, which has value. But then there's just like tons and tons of squats and step ups, which are also good, but only if balanced with hip thrusts and hinging and hamstring work, right?
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I value step ups too, but again, I think it's for the kids, it's hard for them to kind of get the right movement,
Yeah.
they'll
Kind of
push off
push
that
off.
bottom leg.
Yeah.
So then it's like the glute gain is, it's
Sure.
gone almost.
Yeah,
So yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Very helpful. And then let's go maybe just work up the road and go to maybe core stuff. You mentioned a couple that are more like, dumbbell core exercises, maybe not the traditional leg
Yeah.
lifts and arch ups, but what other things on the other side of that?
So yeah, the dumbbell ones that we've mentioned, dead bugs, all the
Mhm.
variations like band pull, band push this way, dumbbell hold, band on their legs if you want a bit more like hip flexor strength.
Mhm.
Um, and then bear, all the bear variations, just the
Yep.
hold, the taps, the crawl forward and backward. Yeah, and side plank, any kind of
Yep.
side plank variation
Yep.
again, like just holding it, the rotations, the hip dips or whatever you want to call them.
Mhm.
Yeah, they're kind of the three staples along with any kind of loaded carry.
Yeah, and generally the carries are, I think, criminally underrated too, because that is what the
Oh yeah.
compression forces are in gymnastics, right? Whether it's double,
Yeah.
like a farmer carry is 2 kettlebells for those that are unfamiliar, and it's the compression forces on your spine and having to breathe and brace your core. That's what a lot of landings is. But then like single leg variations, like how do you stay on beam? A lot of that is single leg weight acceptance and compression. So we found a lot
Yeah.
of really great transfer and carryover and heavy suitcase carries to people who are not falling off beam as much.
Yeah, for sure. And along the same line, like we really like the overhead, like,
Yeah.
and just for that bars more, right? Like
Right.
if you're trying to do turns and stuff, you've got that stability on the one arm. And yeah, make it more taxing by making it a march, right? So then you're,
Sure.
lifting that knee up. So yeah.
And then on dead bug and bird dog, which people are, or bear crawl, which people might be not really understanding why that's valuable, which is I think a lot of gymnasts get trapped and they only know how to hollow or dish. They don't understand what a neutral spine brace looks like. And not
Yeah.
everything, but there's a lot of things in gymnastics that punching and, maybe some bounding and stuff that is probably better served with a neutral core canister to accept that load, not only a
Hmm.
hollow. So like a lot of times that core control is actually more important than the actual strength of loading a movement.
Yeah. I think it's just knowing all the different uh, roles of the core, right? Like it's not just creating the movement, it's resisting it and,
Sure.
bracing and all of that stuff. So we
Sure.
try and work
And
all the dimensions.
yeah, and then moving right up to upper body, you mentioned that, Turkish get-ups and or windmills, I think are something that are very valuable. But are there other upper body things that you find are particularly helpful for gymnasts?
Yeah, like we do a lot of just like not horizontal, sorry, vertical pressing. So
Yep.
either like a half kneeling press or a Z press. Just because I think that kind of movement is lacking in gymnastics itself, or that strengthening movement.
Sure.
Just delts, keep them nice and strong. And then the same goes for like horizontal pulling, right? Like we do a lot of pull ups, chin ups, rope climbs. We don't, but in gymnastics, they
Mm,
do. So, the tight lats, it's not going to help for overhead mobility. So then we go for the horizontal to try and, get the stabilizers happy and healthy shoulders. And an easy way we do that with the littles, and especially like in the warm up for the older ones, is just like beam rows, right? Like
mm,
there's always most of the time a beam that's free, right? You set it to 100, a little bit lower, and they all get under the beam and they just row that beam to their chest. Like
mm.
yeah, super easy to do, like to make them do, not so easy to actually perform, but yeah.
Sure. And then I think the last category, which some people maybe are unfamiliar, was what we called accessory work, which is basically just either it's maintenance care work or kind of the smaller things that don't have time, whether it's balance or calf or stuff. And then obviously like prehab work kind of gets bucked in there as well. But I think you mentioned
Mhm.
some side plank climb stuff, some calf stuff. Like what are some other exercises that you find are very helpful in that accessory bucket?
Yeah, like you said, the side plank clam, but also just like the side plank top leg lifts with the
Yep.
bottom leg bent. Getting them to do that like against the wall or a box and keeping their heel there, they really feel that in their butt.
Mm,
Um, Other things like the carries, sometimes we'll do tippy toe too.
sure.
So it's like
Sure.
just adding that extra variation for some
Yeah.
calf. And along that, we also do the bent leg tippy toe. So it's some
Right.
soleus in there.
Yep.
Um, and then, yeah, just other banded stuff like face pulls or sometimes we'll do like side plank rows or just normal plank rows.
Mhm.
Just kind of like the banded small stuff that's in our accessories.
Great. It's great,
Yeah.
man. Just gave a whole program 101 from the start to back.
There you go.
Yeah, and kind of for those that heard all those exercises, go back to what you said before, which is for the logistics, for the smoothness of flow, and for kind of getting it across the week, it's better to be like, all right, are we doing 1 day or 2 days? If we have 2 days, let's kind of split these things up into partial equals and be like, all right, let's do like a lower body one, a core one, and an upper body one is a triplet or a superset
Yep.
two together, and then have another separate one. So like groups can kind of work on like the top and bounce back and forth, and then work their way
Mhm.
down. It's not this big cluster, right? But then on the second day, you have the opposing movements that you didn't quite get. That is really the
Yep.
basics of programming, which is just like a foundational kind of spread, and then maybe some warm up stuff to kind of get the body going and get people ready for those movement patterns. But that essentially is how you program kind of from a starting position.
Yeah, for sure. And that's kind of how the two programs we have differ, right? So we've got like the 3 or 4 day people and then the 2 or 3. So like the 3 day ones can kind of choose. But yeah, within those two, they hit all the same like main lifts, and then the only
Right.
difference is the accessories. So like
Yeah.
yeah, some will just be stolen and put over here in a different spot, just to ensure that everything gets hit all the way through, right?
Sure. And that's a great kind of question, I guess, the next to springboard to is what is different about how you program in the exercises for the older athletes that are kind of in the optional level versus those that are maybe younger and just starting out? Is it the same program, just scaled down a
Mm.
little bit? Is it different exercises? Like I'm thinking one from the athlete doing it point of view and you as a coach having to program for so many groups. That would be a nightmare if you're writing 7 different programs.
Yep. So the compulsories right now, or yeah, all the compulsories, the older compulsories, have like their sheet, but it's just the hypertrophy cycle that the optionals used way back.
Hmm.
So I just will tweak that a little, but they stay at that kind of rep range,
Mhm.
just because their training age isn't so high for lifting,
Sure.
right? So we're just kind of building that base, and then as they get, maybe next summer, their reps are going to decrease a little more. So at the moment they just go down to 6, just because I don't want them to be lifting that much that
Mm,
something could go wrong because they're not doing the movement correctly, right?
sure.
So yeah, we cap it at 6, whereas the optionals will go down to 3.
Cool.
So yeah, that's the difference, but it's the same. Like, they do all the same movements.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, that's good. And I guess the last thing to kind of touch on here before we go too long is, I'm just wondering what your advice is to, coaches who have heard about this, they're interested, they understand it's valuable, and they want to try to start either learning about it, or they want to start kind of teasing the waters maybe when season ends in like 6 months from now. I think a lot of people find these podcasts because they want to get some helpful starting points, but they don't. It's just
mhm.
a lot of information. It's like, this seems really overwhelming to try to do that. So I guess, what is your advice to someone who does want to try to dip their toe in the water finally and start this, or is doing it but wants to do it more?
Mhm. I think the resources you put out are, like, invaluable, right? Like,
Sure.
make sure you've looked at that and figured out what what you think you're gonna gain from it, right? I mean, I guess if you're looking at it, you're interested. And then I think getting, like, somebody who knows what they're doing, I guess, somebody that is, like, qualified in that area to help
Sure.
out. And I think helping out at the beginning, and then sort of, I feel like coaches can be taught how to do it, but they need some guidance to begin with, right? Like, I I don't know. I guess if you're learning to deadlift with a dowel, then we're all good. But then adding the weight and, that first step, I
Yep.
think finding somebody who knows what they're doing, even if it's just for like a couple of weeks, right? To show you the ropes,
Right.
to get the kids going, and then from there you continue that program. Um,
Sure.
and I think the first step of starting is obviously the hardest, right? Like,
Yeah.
just getting the
Right.
ball rolling, and once you're in it, you're in it, and it's good to go. But it's that initial phase.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that's how, looking back on when I started, I think people maybe understand me now as someone who's pretty decent at this. But when we first started, when I was learning, taking my CSCS, it was like 2015, I think I took mine, or 14 or 15. And it was like, okay, I'm going to commit an hour per day, or X amount of
Yeah.
hours per week to take courses, to learn, to read, to try to do these things myself. But also, for the first 2 years that we lifted in the off season, we actually took our athletes to another facility of a friend of mine
Mm.
where I was working out, and he was the one who was teaching them how to squat and deadlift and press and stuff like that. And so actually, I kind of cut my chops by equal part commitment to learning and doing on my own, but equal, like, watching people coach and watching people program
Mhm.
and watching people fix on the fly. So that's probably the best place to start, which is like, okay, we're going to all, I don't know, we're going to buy the NSCA textbook, and we're going to each read that, or we're going to do something. We're going to get some articles, or we're going to take a course together or something like that, and digest a
Yeah.
little bit, but then also maybe hire somebody, a strength coach who is working in sports already and understands maybe the basics of gymnastics and can look at our stuff or others and be like, okay, we're going to
Mhm.
do this first summer as a joint. We'll hire you once a week or twice a week to come in and do these hour sessions. So it's not super financially taxing, but a combination of you doing it on your own and then asking their questions, picking their brain, watching them program, maybe over a year or two, you can slowly learn how to do this yourself. And then if you want to be
Mhm.
the person like you've become for your gym, of the person who kind of does it all, that's a good way to do it. But trying to just do it all without a strength coach is the equivalent of like trying to teach somebody your Chanko and you've never gone to Congress and learned a single drill. You're just like, all right, let's see how it
Mhm.
goes. Like, it's probably not going
Mhm.
to end well.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think also on that, like, even though I had CSCS, like, the
Mm,
starting and the initial phase is still, like, so overwhelming, and how
yeah.
do you do it? And
Yeah.
it's like I said, that initial step of making a program, implementing it, and then figuring out how to do it from there. Like,
Mm,
what's working, what's not working, what are we going
mm,
to change? Like, so currently, somehow every program I make takes about 25, 30 minutes.
yep.
And I've just got to the point of knowing how long things are going to take. But
Sure.
initially, it was like, had no clue, right?
Yeah.
Um, Obviously, it gets easier as the kids get more proficient, and they're used to it too. They're just, like, efficient going through it. Um, but it's, yeah, like, you're going to make mistakes just in programming and all of that. But
Sure.
it is what it is. You have to kind of get through that to get to a point where you're happy with it, right? And even now, I'm like, there's still things as they come up that I don't want to happen again, you know, like.
Yeah. We've all had those guilty moments of you write a program and you think it's going to take 30 minutes and it's like way long, or you write something that you don't think is going to be that hard and the kids are dead the next day and you're like, oh, my bad.
Yeah,
Like, yeah, that's part of the process of learning.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, useful too in asking the kids how they're doing. Like every day after they've had a heavy session, I'm like, how's your body? How are you feeling? And most of the time now they're fine. They don't feel it, which is great. They're at a place where like it's, it's steady and
manageable.
consistent, and exactly. But yeah, those mistakes are inevitable, and you just got to kind of learn and move on, and not let them happen again.
This was very, very helpful. I think that was like a crash course in how to start. And I think there's a lot of valuable information inside of there, but I definitely want you to tell people your Instagram and where you find it, because you put out a lot of great content. That's very, very helpful. So where can they find you?
Yeah. It's just at Coach Tiz on Instagram. And it's just usually videos of kids lifting at the moment, just being mind blown by how strong they are. But there'll be more content too.
Soon enough, I'm sure the Tiz machine will build out for consulting and helping people learn how to do it. So I'm excited for that.
Yeah, I would like to. Yeah.
I have no doubt.
Make that happen.
I have no
doubt. Thank you.
Well, Tiz, thank you so much. And we'll be sure to get this up in a rather quick fashion so people can digest it.
Yeah, perfect. Sounds good. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
Great.
Take care.
Yeah, you too.